happy to kind of take things on a tangent. Some of the material you may have heard before, especially in the history section, but I really tried to focus today's history section on sports and residential schools. So going into a little more deeper dive. But again, if I'm unable to answer your question, I'll have a slide right at the end that includes an email, and just, yeah, feel free to send us an email if you want us to explore a topic further or need just a little more time for myself to kind of gather those answers if I wasn't able to get them going. So with that, I am going to share my screen. Here we are. And kind of really jump in and get started, just because I have until about 11:15. So we'll see how far we can go. So I also have some video clips in here too that I might want to show.
Kayla, I just want to add, I'm speaking after you, so don't feel rushed. I am very okay with condensing mine, and I don't think I will need the full 45 minutes. So don't feel rushed.
All right, sounds good. So the first slide, when it wants to work for me, I want to show is just a full map of all the recognized residential schools under the URSA agreement, or the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. So as you can see, it goes all across the country from the East Coast, West Coast, North and South. I have it color coded. So what you can garner from those colors are the different church denominations. So you see the majority are orange dots. Those represent our Catholic residential schools. Yellow are Anglican. Blue are United. Green Presbyterian. And then there's some kind of unique colors that you'll see in there too. So out in the Yukon, right around Whitehorse there, you'll see a color that's purple. That's a Baptist school. That was the only Baptist one that we had. Out on the East Coast, you'll see that there are five dark purple circles. Those represent the Moravian mission schools. They actually are covered under a separate agreement. Originally, they were excluded from the URSA agreement. Technically, there was only one Atlantic residential school that's recognized, which is Shubenacadie on Nova Scotia there. Now up in the north, you'll notice there's lots of kind of these off gray colors. Those are non-denominational schools. They did not open until after about World War II or so, when the country was really focusing on sovereignty of the north. So we have culling of Inuit sled dogs, we have forced relocation of Inuit communities further up north, and then we have the opening of these non-denominational schools to indicate that there are permanent settlements up there. So we can't have the Russians encroaching on a territory. Now, the last color I'll highlight is up in northwestern Ontario. You'll see there's 3 schools there. Those were actually Mennonite schools that were run. And then I have a couple of schools circled here, one up in Nunavut, one in Saskatchewan, and 3 purple ones. Now, the 3 purple ones are the first ones funded in Canada. We had residential schools in existence from the first missionaries setting foot, so about the 1600s onwards, but it wasn't until Confederation that the federal government actually got involved. And so those 3 circled schools there are the first ones funded. There are St. Mary's Mission in British Columbia. Then we have in Ontario, the Spanish School, and then Mount Elgin. Now, the green circled one you see in Nunavut is the last residential school opened. Does anyone want to hazard a guess, throw it in the chat, when that last residential school opened in Canada?
Probably in the 70s or 80s.
Ooh, that's very close. Do you want to try a specific date?
I'd say 78.
Okay, not bad. That's pretty close. Often people guess in the 50s or 60s. The last school opened in 1985, Kilovet Hall.
Wow.
And what's interesting about that is it wasn't originally included on the URSA agreement. It was only just added May 2019. So as time goes on, don't be surprised if there are more schools that end up on this list as more research delves deeper into some of those mysteries that exist. And then that last residential school closed, that's the blue circled one in Saskatchewan. You often hear the dates 1996 and 1998 thrown around. And the reason why you have 2 different dates is 1996 is the year the last residence closed, but there were still former residential schools operating as late as 1998, even though they did not have students residing at the school. So here in Manitoba, we had 14 residential schools. Most schools across the country have been torn down. The ones that are still standing here in Manitoba are the Dauphin, or the former McKay School. It's now used by social services. There's the Assiniboia School here in Winnipeg, which you can go and visit. It's just off Academy Road past the St. James Bridge. And then finally, we have the Port La Prairie School, which is now used by Long Plain First Nation, and they're working towards creating a memorial site, an archive, a museum, and learning place. Now, what I wanted you to take away from the map and from this chart that I have up here is that there are only 141 schools recognized, plus the 5 in Newfoundland and Labrador. The majority of institutions that were put forward for recognition were excluded from the agreement. What you see up there is the quick breakdown. The majority of these institutions were excluded because they were run solely by the province or territory, but we have other cases where they were a day school, or there wasn't enough information, or they were operated solely by a religious organization. So in total, there are about 1,400 institutions put forward for recognition, so only 9.4% are recognized. And to just take into account the vast system of colonization we had here in Canada through these recognized residential schools, unrecognized residential schools, day schools, we have Indian hospitals and sanatoriums. So the system and effects of these colonial systems is much broader than those 141 dots that we saw on screen. Now, how they kind of culled or chose what schools would be recognized under the agreement. There were 2 components. Number 1, students were removed from home and placed into the institution for education means. So if it was a hospital or a convent or a home for boys, it was not included because the main purpose wasn't for education. And the second part is that the federal government, Canada, had to be shown to be involved in some way, either in funding the school, administering, work at the school, etc. So if they could not prove those 2 components, that school was not recognized. Now, the next slide I wanted to jump into was a very kind of run dash through some components or pieces about the residential school experience. A really great reader that I recommend, if you did not get a copy from last year of They Came for the Children, I can link to a PDF copy. I didn't hand them out this year. This year we were handing out copies of The Knock on the Door. So They Came for the Children is a very nice short volume. Chapter 2 covers the residential school experience. So I'm only going to kind of glance over some of the main points I want you to take away, simply because you likely have heard some of these before. But the piece I want to focus on often is health, resistance, and in this case for your presentation, spending a lot of time on sports and recreation. So up there on screen, I have a snapshot of children being taken by truck to residential school. So assault on Indigenous identity happened right when the students arrived at the school. They'd be roughly bathed, examined for vermin. If they had long hair, it was cut. The reason why it was often very traumatic for students to have their hair cut is back home in communities, the cutting of the hair wasn't something done unless there was someone who had maybe passed away or something to show mourning. So oftentimes when there was a language barrier and the students couldn't ask what had happened, they'd have their hair cut and wonder, did my mom pass away? Did my dad pass away? Did something happen that I'm unable to know what was going on? There was segregation of boys and girls, young versus old. We also have in our collection a number of photographs which are about marriages happening at residential schools. So residential school system was really meant to assimilate the population, Christianize the population, as well as control the family dynamics. So they didn't want students going back home to their communities to marry youth who did not go to residential school. The preference was that students should marry students and then move to the city or a farming community where they could continue the great lessons they were supposedly have learned at residential school. Life was very highly regimented. They had bells which then dictated when they were to wake up, when they were to eat, pray, study, play, and sleep. And then as educational institutions, the residential schools were considered to be failures and were regularly deemed as such. In the 1930s, only 3% of students went beyond the grade 6 education, compared to 33% of the Canadian population. And unfortunately, the schools, they lack supplies such as readers, textbooks, and other materials. Religion was often seen as of greater importance for education, although they did teach the very basics of reading, writing, arithmetic. Again, the whole focus was to ensure that the young boys were able to work in farming communities or do things like cobbling, tailoring, carpentry, small engine repair, and that the girls would be taught to be homemakers, good Christian mothers. So attendance, or I should say attracting and keeping good teachers at residential schools was an ongoing problem right from the start. In fact, one of the reports which recommended the expansion of the school system here in Canada stated that they should create a partnership with religious organizations, because for them, they are missionaries. They are working on components such as charity, and they wouldn't mind being paid less than, say, an individual who wasn't doing this out of the goodness of their heart. That was kind of the basis that they were working off of. So right from the get-go, students, or I should say the schools, depended on labor from the students themselves. It was thought that they could be self-supporting institutions. They had a large body of folks who could work the fields to gather the food and to take care of the livestock that they had. Unfortunately, that wasn't taking into consideration that these are, young children from the ages of 6 to 10 who would be able to do that. So up until the 50s, the majority of schools were working on a half-day system. So half the day they're in classes learning their lessons. The other half of the day they are spent working on their chores to ensure that the school could keep operating. So food and diet at the schools is a thing that you often hear residential school survivors share, that they saw that the staff were often better fed than themselves. And it's not necessarily luxury items. They're looking at things like bacon and eggs for breakfast as compared to porridge or other pieces or other unpalatable foods. Oftentimes, students coming from traditional homes were not used to processed meats, processed cheese, and they had a very difficult time adjusting to a new and strange diet. And a very interesting component that I found or learned about is, if you take a look at the proportion of Indigenous peoples who are lactose intolerant, we see that there's a higher number as compared to the Caucasian population. And what were they serving at all these meals? They had milk or various forms of powdered milk. And so oftentimes you see that a lot of students were actually suffering from intestinal troubles and the like. So as I mentioned, the schools were working using student labor to ensure that things could keep going. So up here I had a picture of the laundry room here. A lot of the labor was divided by gender and it was regimented. We had the boys oftentimes working outside, doing chores, as I mentioned, working on the farm, working with the livestock, cutting cordwood, things like that, while the girls were inside doing the cooking, cleaning, laundry, or sewing. Now, although there was this division of labor, it was still sometimes dangerous. We read accidents of people accidentally, losing fingers while cutting or using sharp objects in the kitchen or outdoors, getting hands caught in wringers, accidentally having boiling water spilt on them. So we know whether they worked inside or outside, it was still very dangerous. The boys weren't as monitored as closely outside, so they had a little more time for recreation compared to the girls, who were often monitored very closely and kept indoors. Now, before I move on, did we have any kind of questions pop up just on the general history or any comments people would like to share? Okay, well, I'll continue if they pop up. I got the little video I can see. So as I mentioned, I always touch on health, death, and resistance at residential schools. The chronic underfunding and overcrowding of schools undermine the health of students. In 50% of known cases of causes of death, it's due to tuberculosis, influenza, pneumonia, and really general lung disease. But I always have to emphasize, we do not have clear numbers as to the number of children who attended residential school. We have a rough estimate as it being 150,000. And we have a rough estimate as to how many children passed away at residential school. And if you do a quick Google check online for stats, you will find numbers anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000, 6,000 to as high as 9,000 children having died. The chart I have up there on screen are the total number of students we have identified by name who passed away at residential school, and that's a breakdown of the causes of their death. But you'll see the majority, 47%, have unknown listed, and that's because they often didn't have a physician or a nurse on hand to actually identify what was the cause of death. But since September 2019, we've added 269 new names to the list. And so we are working with communities, and we always encourage people to reach out to us to check out the list, see if there's anybody who is missing, anyone who might not actually be on that list. And so if we combined our named and unnamed list, our number is approximately 4,800, and we're continuing to do research into this area as we delve deeper into some of the French records that we have in our collection. So up there on screen, I have the list of the top schools that had the highest casualty numbers. You'll see majority of them come from Saskatchewan. There were 5 schools that take up quite a large bit. So 20 schools account for 51% of the deaths, whereas the other 88 schools account for 49%. You'll see in Manitoba, we had 1 school which had a high number, 74, and that was the Brandon School, which was in operation for about 76 or 79 years thereabouts. The NR represents our northern schools. Ontario had 3 schools, BC 2 schools, Alberta 5, and Saskatchewan also 5. So when it comes to resistance, this is a piece that people often haven't heard about, but resistance occurred both passively and actively from students, parents, communities. Children, they resisted and rebelled by frustrating authority figures, stealing food from the kitchen, fighting with fists and weapons, running away and setting fires. There were over 53 cases of major fires happening at residential schools, with some additional 175 smaller fires, with about 27 or so being set deliberately by the students themselves. And in addition to that, students ran away. They often took great risks to try and return back home, and we know of 33 cases of students who had died in their attempts to escape. Parents and communities, they lobbied for day schools, for on-reserve boarding schools, better food, less discipline, more education, and less drudgery. So there was active resistance. There was a lot that communities were trying to do to protect their students, but unfortunately, the federal government and the system was oftentimes too difficult to push back against. We had parents and family members who were jailed because they didn't put their children in residential schools. We had fines that were placed on them. We had lots of things going on to try and enforce these regulations. Now, I can't remember if I showed this last year, but I wanted to just show you a quick snapshot into residential schools in Canada for the year 1948. The reason I picked 1948, that just so happens to be a year where we had a lot of records surviving. The records I use are financial documents, quarterly returns, which showcase information about the students in the residential school. So there you can get a quick breakdown. In 3 months between July and September, we had approximately 10,000 children in school, but you'll notice right above that, I have a row that says lost. So we had 65 records that had survived, 10 schools I don't have records for. And so that's my estimate as to what those 10 schools might have held. You'll notice just below that, there were 520 communities affected. And when it comes to any statistics or numbers revolving around residential schools, you always have to take it as the lowest base estimate because of the destruction of records and the loss of records, as well as we have to ensure that whatever information that we're pulling from it might not actually be as accurate as we thought. In some cases, there were some schools that didn't record where students were coming from. So with that, that was the total number I could find. You'll see the average age is between 10 and 12 years old. The reason why Manitoba is a little higher is the Brandon Residential School offered high school level classes, so older students could actually attend the school and get those higher grades. You'll notice the youngest and oldest student is 2 and 20, much younger and much older than the 7 and 15 age range that was outlined by the Indian Act. Again, you have to take it as a case-by-case basis as to why children as young as that might be in the school. Oftentimes there might be something happening at home or where one or both parents have been incapacitated, passed away, or ill. And so the residential school was the only place that could take a child in at that time. Whereas those older students, again, they may be attending the Brandon Residential School or residing at a residence and then say taking classes in community. In this case, there was a student who was taking a business course but was residing at the residential school. And the last two columns I'll touch about is sex, so boys and girls there. It was much easier to recruit girls, keep them in the schools for longer. So you see the numbers there. There were a couple hundred more girls in the schools at the time than boys. And then the last chart there touches on some of the things that they recorded. For instance, the number of children discharged. The reason why it's so high is we're at the end of one school year and at the beginning of another, but you'll notice there's almost as many children who run away who are at truant or at home without permission. There were 65 students receiving treatment for tuberculosis, but that doesn't talk to the spread or extent of it, just the number of children receiving treatment. One you may not have heard before is the Provincial. That was a unique experiment where some schools were equipped with special buildings to take care of students at risk of developing TB, but it was a failure in the fact that those students were still taking classes with a larger student body. So in this case, there was only one Provincial that was still open. There were 173 children who were ill or at hospital in these couple of months. There were 2 outbreaks happening at 2 different residential schools in Manitoba. There was an outbreak of measles. And then in British Columbia, there was an unknown illness that had broken out at one of the schools. There were 11 children who had died in this 3-month period, mostly due to tuberculosis, but there are a few accidents. And then uniquely, there was one school that recorded how many children were working out in the fields. So this should give you like a very quick snapshot into things happening at the residential school. And I highly recommend people check out our archives to delve deeper into where I'm pulling some of these numbers from. But just to keep things moving, so touching on the legacy of residential schools, we have intergenerational trauma, widespread substance abuse, poor health and life expectancy rates, low education rates, massive overrepresentation in the child welfare system and in the justice system, high suicide rates, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, mental health crises, loss of language and culture, which can all be pulled back to these colonial oppressive means and systems. So the last thing I'll touch on before I jump into the sports section is this thing that we often hear about, just getting over it. Why don't our Indigenous populations just get past the things that happened in the past? So, assimilative policies and practices had a hugely detrimental impact on Indigenous communities. And it can be easy for people who haven't experienced those traumas to tell those who've suffered to get over it. But breaking free of the cycle of violence is very difficult. What it requires is resilience. So building resilience within communities, both collective and individual. And this includes reconnecting with cultural teachings, knowledge, worldviews, and practices. And in the now, what we can do to advance the process of reconciliation in the learning environment is understand the impact these historical injustices have and the current relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and Canadians. And this is a very kind of good way to start that first step. Now, were there any other questions, or I should say, any questions before I jump into the sports section? Okay. Now, one of the speakers I had advocated to come speak today was Eugene Arkand. He is one of our members of our governing circle, was previously a residential school representative for our organization, but just due to COVID, he's not very comfortable speaking on online events. But once things open up and it's safe to travel again, he really wants to come down and speak to the members of the Manitoba Aboriginal Sport and Recreation Council. His story is a really great story. He's very engaged. And before us, coming and creating this presentation, I spoke to him a lot and engaged to share some of his story. So throughout this whole presentation on the sports section, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about Eugene, his thoughts and such, coming from some articles that were published about his experience in residential school and his experience from sports. So Eugene Arkand, he's a Cree man from the Muskeg Lake First Nation in Saskatchewan. He spent 9 years at the St. Michael's Indian Residential School and 2 years at the Brett Student Residence. He is a First Nations Sport Hall of Fame inductee and has dedicated much of his time to organizing regional and national events. So that's First Nation sporting events, cultural events, tourism, and events geared at advancing sports for First Nations youth. So over the past few years, through the Indian Residential School Survivor Committee at the TRC, he's also represented our NCTR as the Governing Circle and Survivor Circle, as I mentioned, and he's worked both in the public and private to inform communities about the development and process associated with the settlement agreement. Now up there on screen, you'll see Eugene there. He's holding a picture, and then I have a zoomed in version of what that picture is. So at his time at St. Michael's, he had one First Nations teacher named Miss Peggy, and she actually took this picture clandestinely when it was about 3 months into their attendance at the residential school, about 1958 or 1959. So Eugene met Miss Peggy about 12 years ago, got a copy of this photo, and it has traveled with him, or actually this entire time. He hasn't traveled alone, he says. He carries this picture with him everywhere he goes. And out of those 32 students you see, there are about 9 who are still alive today. Eugene credits 3 things that saved his life: his wife, re-engaging with his culture, and sports. So in 2019, he actually worked with the Journal of Sport History to publish 2 articles, one about his 11-year journey of indoctrination and one about sports that saved his life. Now, although Eugene couldn't come here today, he hopes that I can share some of this information for you and that he can come and speak to you sometime in the future. So jumping into the sports section, Indigenous children had their own games and recreational activities, most of which were intended to help them develop necessary skills for adulthood. So there would be contests that tested strength, endurance, and skill that were common in Indigenous communities. Games could also further military aims, cement diplomatic alliances, and celebrate victories. And they were also used to promote stability. So some examples include wrestling, racing, high kicking, throwing spears, shooting arrows. There were also ball games like the Mohawk Tawarathon, which then developed into lacrosse. And there was also shinny and old fashioned, which were Mi'kmaq and Maliseet versions of hockey, and then an Inuit game called Anulagtuk. Now, some children played these games that they had learned at home in residential schools. So it's important to just keep in mind that the residential school system did not just bring organized sports to Indigenous communities. It was there long before then. Now I'm going to take a quick pause because I have a quick little video I'm going to show. See if I can do this. I'm working with 2 screens, which is sometimes a little more difficult. Okay, there you go. The first time I clicked it, I didn't think you'd be able to hear. So let's make sure that you're able to hear this video.
It's a gift from the Creator. It's a medicine game. It's a game that has historical and spiritual connection. What was taught to me was that the game was played if there was a drought, if there was a conflict, if there was a war, if there was starvation, if there was disease. Somebody would take it upon themselves, say, let's have the game of lacrosse. Let's play a game for the Creator to change what has been happening to us, something negative. And the whole community is engaged in playing the sport, in the preparation of the sport, of the preparation of the game, the choosing of the number of players, how many goals we win, how do you set up the field and that. And the feast that goes with it too, the offering of tobacco to each other and also the offering back to the Creator. So all of that was part of the preparation and the celebration of both sides coming together and saying, okay, it's settled. We've done our best. And so it became the medicine game that we need.
I was always taught that you don't just step on the floor for you. You step on the floor for people who can't do it anymore. You step on the floor for people who are not around anymore. And you step on the floor for the sense of the pride of where you're playing. If you go to a game on the reserve or wherever it may be, you'll see a bunch of older gentlemen standing around watching the game. really, really watching the game, because these are the older guys that were a part of this that can't play anymore.
Okay. So I have a couple of these little clips that I'll be playing throughout. All right, back to the presentation. So for the missionaries who established these schools, many viewed organized sports as a means to contribute to the development of manly qualities. Sport programs played a really big role at residential schools in some cases and were seen as a way to help Christianize and civilize students. However, there was a concern that if a sport was not closely controlled, it would delay assimilation. And so there needed to be strict regulation to ensure that sports did not encourage Indian customs. So up there I have a quote from an individual from a residential school who managed a football team in the United States. We put aside Indian thoughts and Indian ways, Indian dress and Indian speech. We don't want to hold on to anything Indian. So up there on screen, I have a picture from Carlisle Residential School in Pennsylvania. It was one of the schools that inspired the expansion of the residential school system here in Canada. So we have pictured Jim Thorpe, one of the Indigenous athletes, very prominent in the United States. He attended Carlisle School, as well as a school I'm going to touch on in the next slide. And right next to him, we have another Indigenous athlete, Louis Tewanima. And then right at the end, we have Glenn Pop Warner, who was an influential individual for the expansion of the football game in America. So here I have a picture of the 1926 team of the Haskell Institute in Kansas. So sports was actually even bigger for Native American boarding schools in the United States. In fact, the Kansas Institute raised $185,000 in 1926 for the building of a stadium. And so this is based mostly on the Indigenous communities surrounding this territory. In today's money, that's $2,700,000. So the residential school system here in Canada never had any large-scale sporting facilities. But I thought you might find it very interesting to see the history, a little bit of the history from the United States. So this was a reunion that they had in 1926 when they opened up the stadium. So this is what it looks like today. So thrown into my presentation, I have a couple different quotes from survivors about sports. In this case, this is a quote from Noel Starblanket. And he says, "I had some good memories, in particular in the sports side, because I really enjoyed sports. I was quite athletic, and basically that's what kept me alive. That's what kept me going. When I was forced to go back after holidays or things like that, the only thing I wanted to go back to was for the sports, nothing else. I didn't want to go back for the teaching, for the teachers, for the Christian indoctrination, or the strapping or any other abuses. I wanted to go back for the sports. That was the only thing I went back for." So up here on screen, I'm going to showcase a couple different photos. And these pictures look like countless other photos of teams, you'll notice. We have lines of students dressed in uniform with equipment, staring intently in the camera. And when you look at these pictures, these are supposed to foster ideas about belonging, health, friendship, social network. Now, Eugene explains when he shows his collection of sport photos, and I think he says he has 150 to 170 of them, what these pictures actually hide. There are injuries children have from beatings and punishment. You often see clean and unused equipment that's been rented. And so what you're supposed to take away in a number of these cases is that photos have been staged. At first glance, these pictures are imparting stories that look like they're different from the dominant narrative of abuse, neglect. They suggest sport participation made these horrors more bearable. And it lends weight to the notion that sports was a positive feature. Now, photographs of sports in residential schools were used to reinforce positive assumptions about the schooling, distracting people and silencing critics about the destruction that the schools were causing. And so whenever you take a look at photos, again, I often recommend people, use your critical eye. We see in this picture the one young man holding a trophy, and it looks like he has a black eye. Was that caused during the game, or was this an injury that he had taken at the school from some other reason? And when you do get Eugene to show some of those photos, he has a picture of students from the baseball team, and you'll see that they're all wearing gloves and such. And that was to actually hide the fact that they had been strapped, and that for a number of students, their hands were so swollen, they had to kind of really squeeze them into that baseball mitt. So sports at residential school, there were a lot of quite popular ones: football, baseball, soccer, hockey, lacrosse, and boxing. In the 1890s, students were playing all these different games, and then the Indian Affairs Inspector of Battleford Schools said, "A noticeable feature is the school's games. They're all thoroughly and distinctively white. The boys use boxing gloves with little to no science and excellent temper, and play good games of cricket and football with the greatest interest in truly Anglo-Saxon vigor. The girls dress dolls, make fancy articles of dress, and play games as white children do. From all the recreation, Indianism has been excluded." Now, in his article, Eugene observed that when he first arrived at the residential school on the second day, after he ate in the main dining hall, he went outside and saw that the soccer team was actually just finishing up the practice. And the students who participated on that team appeared to get better food than everyone else. He also learned that at residential schools, if you played sports, you were fed better, you were treated better, and that student athletes could leave the campus to compete against other teams. Here I have a quote from Geraldine. "One of the good things that I would do is to try and get out of just the abuse was to go out and join the track meet, and I was quite athletic in boarding school. I also joined the band, I played trombone, and that was something that took me away from the school, and it was a relief." So Eugene states that in the sporting facilities often felt safer than the playroom, infirmary, or dorm. He wanted to be one of the big boys so that the perverts and others would leave him alone. For Eugene, sports took him around the world and saved his life, but it also provided him with survival skills. So for girls, they were at residential school, they were expected to lead a more sedentary life and engage in quiet activities. So competitive sports was considered inappropriate. And it wasn't until a little later on that we actually see photographs of girls on sports teams. In those early years, you see them participating in croquet, skating, tobogganing. They were often limited to walking, calisthenics, and the use of light weights. But when girls were eventually allowed to participate in competitive sport, they often did very well. From a 1959 report on a winter carnival for the Birtle School, the principal stated that we obtained the town rink for the afternoon and had 2 games of hockey. Our girls played the town girls and won their game. I've gotten them new red and white sweaters in which they look very lovely. The colors were chosen by the students. Their games are very nice to watch, and people go for that much more than the boys' hockey. It has amazed me how our girls have taken a hold. There is no hesitancy whatsoever, and it's given them a feeling of importance, at least on the same basis as the boys. So I have just a couple pictures of what physical education looked like in those early years. So again, it's standing out, doing light weights, doing stretches and walks. Either around the residential school property, or they might go walking out into, say, some paths, or maybe in and around town if they were close enough. And then the next couple photos I have are when our young girls are actually seen participating on teams. This is the 1938 Camperville girls baseball team posing with a visiting bishop. Here's the 1940 Camsack girls hockey team. The 1940s Old Sun girls softball team. And then a 1960s Daamos girls broomball team. So again, if you're ever wanting to find sports-related photographs, you can jump onto our database. I have a collection of hundreds of these photos. There are lots of sports photos taken of the students either engaging in activities at the residential school or posing with trophies and certificates that they won for their achievement in tournaments and the like. Now, the main bulk that you can take away from sports at residential schools is that they were poorly funded and poorly supplied. The federal government never invested heavily in sports or recreation and the arts, although the administrators of schools often justified that they were very good measures intended to further assimilate the students. So schools were forced to turn to outside sponsors. And furthermore, because of limited funding, again, it made it very difficult to keep qualified coaches. In an 1897 report, the principal of the Calgary School thanked various football teams in the district for having taken the trouble and expense to visit with the students and play with them. In a 1928 newspaper report, the Alert Bay principal thanked a friend of the school who donated 2 complete sets of football uniforms for the students. In 1940, R.A. Hugh informed the Presbyterian Women's Missionary Society that from experience, there could be very excellent work done in physical and manual instruction while avoiding expenditures on equipment. When a request came in 1943 for sporting equipment, he informed them that all sporting goods were being shipped to the armed forces because there was an embargo on sporting equipment or unnecessary items during the war. But conditions did not improve even after the post-war period. In Eugene's article, he states that students were never expected to have proper equipment. For hockey, decent skates would be battled over and sometimes they wouldn't match, which required students to actually trade with one another to find a best fitting pair. Another example he gave in his article is that when his hockey stick broke on the ice, he was drilled in the ear and punched for it. And I found really interesting in relation to this, at the time that Eugene was in residential school and reading the final report, there is discussion about Duck Lake specifically getting very poor, dry hockey sticks at that time. And there were complaints about these hockey sticks ranging from the 1950s all the way up into the 1970s. So up there, I have a little snapshot that I actually was able to pull from a Winnipeg Free Press newspaper. It's from 1954, and it states that the Winnipeg Lions Club is donating skates for Norway House youth. In the column that they ran the previous week, Reverend Kenway McLeod, principal of the Norway House School, requested new and used skates for youngsters. And yesterday, they were delighted to learn that Bruce Cheatley from the Winnipeg Lions Club had taken up the request, and pretty soon they were expected to receive some skates. 1956 survey of both residential schools and day schools across the country determined that most schools, there appeared to be little or no physical education programs. A number of them did not have facilities for activities. Basement areas that were designed for play were very inadequate and were utilized often for storage or assembly purposes. And a large number of the schools were not properly cleaned, graded, and prepared for play spaces. And oftentimes students were sent out into the brush where there were shrubs, thistles, and grasses and weeds, which was very unkempt and neglected. Now, when given access to resources, even limited ones, Indigenous students often achieved impressive levels of skill and accomplishment. So in the 1940s, there was a very interesting individual, a Danish national, who moved to Canada. His name was Ian Eisenhardt, and he was director of the Young People's Work Program in BC. And so in the 1940s, he actually went and visited some residential schools, and he visited the Christie one. He said, personally, I've never seen better executed pyramids anywhere for this age group which you are dealing with. And one of your pictures, the group with the girls, is regarded to expression as the very finest I've ever seen. So in response to that, he reached out to R.A. Hugh to discuss the creation of a video by the National Film Board depicting the great gymnastic skills of some of these British Columbian residential schools. Here's just a few pictures from that I was able to find in our collection. So in 1946, as the director of physical fitness for the federal government, he worked to try and get this National Film Board a short made about physical education. He said it would be a worthwhile item insofar as not only to credit the Indians with this training and focus on the attention of how far Indians could go with good leadership, but would also be a stimulator for the white people in Canada when they are challenged with this documentary facts as to the ability of Indian boys in schools. So he looked or sought for funding for Indian Affairs to also send this gymnastics team on a cross-country tour. While they were engaged in talks, however, it was determined that this was actually going to be far too expensive. And so this was the letter that he received back in return in January of 1946. So Philip Flynn states that while Mr. Huey promised $2,500 for this project, there was no other means to raise or obtain the other half of the funds. And through my research and access to our archive, I've been unable to locate any film or other mention of this video. And in fact, I learned that Ian Eisenhart, he actually quit. He went to work with the United Nations for a couple of years and then came back to Canada in 1951, where he was hired as a director for physical education in the Indian Affairs Office. So, as I mentioned, in 1950, Ian was appointed the Director of Sports and Games within the Department of Indian Affairs. He was actually later fired for alleged communist sympathies, and he was blacklisted from future employment with the federal government. It wasn't until 1999, at the age of 93, that he was actually recognized for the efforts in creating this pro-rec program in British Columbia. So his most enduring legacy was actually the Tong Longboat Award. So he first proposed that award be established alongside the Amateur Athletic Union of Canada to be given to First Nations athletes. The name of the award would be after the famed athlete Tom Longboat. So the AAUC agreed, but only as long as it could take full credit for the award. So it was initially funded by the Dominion Bridge Company, and athletes were nominated by Indian agents. Most of them actually came from residential schools or integrated schools in those first couple of years. So between 1951 and 1972, Indian Affairs and the AAUC shared responsibility. The National Indian Brotherhood, which later became the Assembly of First Nations, took over the responsibility of the award in 1973. And since 1998, the awards have been administered by the Aboriginal Sports Circle. So a couple last little slides here. So I was a good athlete, I was a good hockey player, I was a good runner, and I was a good jumper. So that, I guess, started getting me patted on the back. I started getting a little bit of recognition as an athlete. So because I could outrun anyone, outjump anyone, and I was a good ball player too. This is a comment from Albert Fiddler from the Beauval School, which leads us into sports and excellence. So in his article, Eugene states that the missionaries really enjoyed showing off student athletes. Teams of the best students would be chosen to travel and compete against settler teams. Competition was stiff. Students would actively hurt each other in order to get on these competing teams. And in Eugene's experience as part of the school soccer team, they never lost a game in 4 years. But with that, Eugene states that they never ever played home games, and wherever they played, students were booed and called derogatory names. He said it was exactly like it was depicted in the film Indian Horse, about Saul Indian Horse and his experiences in hockey. And he never got to experience being cheered on by supporters. Even when he was attending Lebret, the residence, Eugene and a number of other students were actually bused to a school named Bert Fox. And even though he and other Indigenous students attended the same school, they were always pitted against each other. Bert Fox versus the Lebret residents. Now the St. Michael's Indians, which was their hockey team, won the championship of an 8-league team in 1946. In 1948, the same team won the Northern Saskatchewan Midget Championship, and the following year it won the Provincial Championship with Fred Saskamoos on the team. Now all the boys at the Capel Residential School, the high school team, played on that hockey team, and they were called the Lebret Indians. They also had a baseball team, which they won an award in 1948. And one of their star hockey players, Arthur Aubrey, would win the 1951 Tom Longboat Award for Saskatchewan, and then the Tom Longboat Award for Best Athlete in Canada in 1960. So there were a number of successes in the 1940s and 50s for hockey teams and other sporting teams. But what to pull about from that is that the success of these sporting teams was not just about the sport, but for those administrators of the school is about promoting the successes of the church, promoting the successes of what they could do with those students. And up there I have a couple of, again, newspaper articles that I pulled from Manitoba newspapers. So the first one's for Bertel, December 12th, 1937. 2 hockey teams from Bertel visited Fox Warren where they won 7-2 and 9-2 against the Fox Peewees and Midgets. Interestingly enough, there was a 1949 report by the principal who states that his hockey team was so good, it had run out of opponents. The local team was actually through with them and had been beaten so many times that they had given up hope of beating their lads and no longer wanted to play with them. The town of Russell may want a game later, and Biscarth happened to see those students play the Russell team and they don't want to compete against them. So our only hope is Shoal League. In the middle article, that one's from 1959. It says Portage team wins Batnam Puck Tournament. Portage captured top honors in the Batnam BB Hockey Tournament. The Portage team trounced Minnedosa 7-1 after beating Brookdale by the same score and blanking McCreary 7-0. And the last one I have there is the Brandon Indian Residential School Captures Tournament, represents Brandon on the 28th. This is from 1969. The Brandon School topped a 5-team tournament over the weekend in the Brandon Minor C Soccer League. Now, although only a few students went on to play sports professionally, for many others, sports remained an ongoing and positive part of their life. There were a number of former residential school students who played a role in the organizing of the Indigenous Sports Olympic Association in Spole in the early 70s, including one of the TRC commissioners, Wilton Littlechild. So the Inspole Thunderbirds was Canada's first all-star Aboriginal junior hockey team. And in the following years, Indigenous hockey teams and leagues such as the Alberta Native Hockey League was established across the country. Now, sports weren't always a good time. This is one of the negative experiences I pulled from the Survivor Speak volume from Rodney Soucy. He says, all I remember about him, being the sports director, is grabbing the dodgeball and making me run and throwing it and hitting me in the head and thinking it was funny. It sent me flying. I remember him picking me up by the throat and holding me in the air, and I remember him dropping me like I was, I don't know, thinking back, no more than 3 feet tall, and dropping me, and he's probably 6'2", 6'3", somewhere around there. He held me up in the air saying I'm probably dropping from, 4 or 5 feet and landing on my head. And all I remember is trying to stand up and getting kicked in the butt. And this hockey stick, he broke a hockey stick that everybody knew. He called it Hector, and he'd hit me and make me stand up. And I remember clearly because I wasn't able to straighten out my head. My head was on my shoulder like that, and I couldn't straighten it out. I couldn't understand why, and it was a long time before I was able to stand up straight. Now, before I move on to our last part of the presentation, which is reconciliation and up to date what's happened with those calls to action regarding sport, did any questions come through?
No questions. Good. There were no questions, but a couple comments that I think we could share. I don't know if everybody saw them. So looking at the photos of the residential school buildings and structures, so Melissa said that the one in Bertel is, let me find that here. The one in Bertel sits at the top of the valley and overlooking the community. So she said it looks really dark and scary. So kind of a good picture there of kind of what still exists today. And then going through more photos later, Pam mentioned that it was like looking at a concentration camp, Victorian concentration camp. So another really, really good point of sort of some trauma through history. Good reference there.
Actually, I don't remember what I was doing, but it was involving sports and concentration camps and the use of sports to try and make those who were held more indoctrinated by the Chinese. I was specifically looking at the ones on mainland China, those who were captured from Hong Kong, and the use of sports. And they actually created for the, I think the Olympic year, a concentration camp Olympic organization where they had teams competing against each other. And again, those who competed would receive better food, better treatment. They were supposed to encourage other peoples to participate in the sports programs. I think they did baseball, track and field, and a number of different activities. And there is some good written description of one participant's experience and what it did and how it affected others. And the hope is that once they were released from these concentration camps or from these prisoner of war camps, they would actually stay in mainland China and work for them. But there was only a very small percentage of people who actually did that. For the most part, they were just playing along so they could get better treatment, better food, and hopefully avoid some of those punishments. Now moving into reconciliation, I first wanted to touch on this great report that was released in 2019. It's by the Environics Institute, and they did this in partnership with Canadian Roots Exchange and the MasterCard Foundation. And the purpose of the study was to establish a benchmark of indicators for reconciliation amongst youth. So the couple ones I just wanted to share were the concept of what does the word reconciliation mean to youth? And you'll see these are the breakdown. For the most part, Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth felt roughly the same thing, that reconciliation meant rebuilding a relationship and rebuilding trust. The second most commonly identified theme was about apologies and making amends. And this was described as acknowledging past wrongs and forgiveness. And the third was focused on repairing and correcting the past. Now, the other question I wanted to highlight was they asked these Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth, what were the barriers to reconciliation? So for the most part, they generally agreed on the significance of barriers. Between 2/3 of youth identified each barrier as moderate, if not major. For Indigenous youth, they were most likely to name myths and stereotypes of what Indigenous people received from Canada as a major barrier, followed by a lack of political leadership willing to impart real change, as well as the lack of knowledge about Indigenous culture and history. And for non-Indigenous youth, they present a very similar order of barriers, but were less likely to consider them as major. This population was also more likely to consider socioeconomic inequalities, myths and stereotypes of what Indigenous people receive, and the lack of political leadership and will to implement change. So there is a full report that you can download, which goes into more detail about what I mentioned earlier. So the Indigenous and non-Indigenous experience with reconciliation, their thoughts around it, and what could be done to improve it. When we talk about reconciliation, as I mentioned in a lot of my presentations, it is a subjective, topic. Depending who you ask, whether at the personal, community, or national level, they may give you a different definition of what reconciliation means. But as for the TRC's definition, they said it is the process of maintaining respectful relationship, which includes repairing damaged trust. And to repair damaged trust, you can make apologies, provide reparations, but the biggest part is following through with actions for real societal change. So if you go and visit the CBC Beyond 94 website, you can get an account as to which calls to action have been completed, which have been started, and which haven't been started. But there are different organizations which will tell you that there are different calls to action that have been addressed or not addressed. The ones I highlighted on purple are the ones that cross both the Yellowbird Institute and Beyond 94. But I can tell you that it's very possible that the government, whether it be federal, municipal, or provincial, might address a call to action one year, but because of the lack of that ongoing commitment, that call to action may fall off the track as to being recognized as being completed or not. So as you can see here, the Yellowbird Institute identifies 9 calls to action which have been addressed, CBC Beyond 9410, and the Government of Canada says that 2/3 are currently underway. So depending where you go, you might get different information and different numbers. Which now brings me to sports and reconciliation. So the sports calls to action are from 87 to 91. Up there on screen, I have a picture from March 28th, 2019, where in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, a game between the Ottawa Senators and the Florida Panthers was held. O Canada was sung in English, French, and Anishinaabe. And the ceremonial face-off had the puck drop between Mark Broderick and Florida Panther rookie Brady Keeper. So there are a number of dignitaries you can see in the background, but it includes Elder Claudette Commanda, her grandson Cody, Assembly of First Nations Chief Perry Bellegarde, ITK's Nathan Obed, Métis President Clément Chartier, and as well as a couple of chiefs. One I actually also wanted to just highlight and touch on from this past year is that on July 28th, 2020, Ethan Bear from Ochapowace First Nation, and that's actually my home community. He got to wear a special jersey at an exhibition game between the Oilers and the Calgary Flames. And he says, I'll be wearing it for all those Indigenous players who came before me and those Indigenous kids dreaming of playing in the NHL. He said in a tweet from the Edmonton Oilers. And so you actually can go and purchase this special jersey, which has his last name, Bear Makwa, in the Cree syllabics. Okay, so touching on some of these calls to action. Number 87 is we call upon the levels of government in collaboration with Sports Hall of Fame, Indigenous peoples, and other relevant organizations to provide a public education that tells the history of Indigenous athletes. So in 2017, Canadian Sports Hall of Fame launched an online exhibit called Canadian History and Society Through the Lens of Sport, which included a segment on Indigenous athletes. The Sports Hall of Fame that year also inducted lacrosse player Gaylord Paulus, who is pictured here in his Oshawa Green Gales jersey. The Saskatchewan Sports Hall of Fame also launched a special exhibit called The Stories of Indigenous Athletes, Rights and Wrongs. It was the first time that the Hall of Fame actually featured Indigenous athletes in the standalone exhibit. And then the Hockey Hall of Fame honored the team made up of residential school survivors from Saugeen. So they were the Saugeen Old Timers, which was formed in 1978. And they hold the title for the 1987 World Cup, the 1989 World Cup in Munich, and the 1987 Canadian National Cup. So if you take a look, second from the left in the back row, that's Ted Fontaine there. So he's one of the survivors I often get to work with to share his experience. In 2018, Michael Linklater and Jocelyn Lacroix were honored at the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame ceremony with the recipients of the 2018 Longboat Awards. These are the two pictured here. In 2019, Cameron Gaylord and Lyric Atchison were the 2019 recipients of the award. I tried to follow up to see if they had announced 2020 recipients, but it doesn't look like they had any information about that. But in 2020-2021, the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame inducted Ross Paulus, who belonged to the Six Nations Confederacy. He was actually the father of Gaylord, who was, I had mentioned it, the recipient for 2017, or inductee. So between 1951 and 53, Ross won 3 consecutive Canadian A senior championship titles. He claimed the Longboat Award twice, was awarded the Mike Kelly Memorial Trophy for Most Valuable Player, and he led the Canadian senior men's lacrosse team to defeat the US at Expo 67 in Montreal. Which moves me on to someone I really wanted to highlight today, which is Fred Saskamoos. A little bit of history about Fred here. He was born at Whitefish Lake. He was raised by his parents in the log house and learned how to skate and play hockey by his grandfather, who taught him using double runner skates over his moccasins. When Fred turned 7, a priest, RCMP officer, and Indian agent visited his home, and it took himself as well as his brother Frank to the St. Michael's Residential School, where he spent 9 years and suffered emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. So although he didn't have skates of his own, he used oversized skates from the older boys until he was rewarded with skates of his own. In 1944, a priest from Montreal named Rossel became the school's sports director and pushed him to develop his skills. And in 1949, the school's team, the Duck Lake Ducks, won that provincial midget championship. And the following year, Rousseau and the general manager of Moose Jaw Canucks asked his parents to allow Fred to attend a hockey training camp. He then played 4 seasons with the Moose Jaw Canucks, and during his last game in 1954, he was named the most valuable player in the Western Canadian Junior Hockey League. A ceremony was held in Edmonton where he received a pipe and headdress, and he said, "I recognized as the most valuable player and as an Indian. That was something." Now, after their last game of that 53-54 season, he received a telegram and was told to report to the Chicago Blackhawks. So Fred played 11 games with the Blackhawks during the 53-54 season and was known as Chief Running Deer, Chief Thunderstick, and Fast Freddy. The organist would always play Indian Love Call when he stepped onto the ice. Now, he did not score any goals or assists, and he collected 6 penalty minutes by the end of the season. And when he went home, he actually didn't keep up his training, so he failed to make the cut for the 54-55 season, although he continued to play with affiliated teams. Now, at the start of the 56 season, Fred played for the Calgary Stampeders, but he only played 2 games before he took a 1,000-kilometer taxi ride back home to Sandy Lake to be with his wife. He later played with the Kamloops Chiefs and the Okanagan Senior Hockey League, and he retired in 1961 after playing with the North Battleford Beavers. Now, from 61 onwards, he used his fame to promote opportunities for youth sports. And in 1962, he was a founding member of the Northern Indian Hockey League. He was also a founding member of initiatives like Saskatchewan Indians Summer and Winter Games, Saskatoon's All-Nation Hockey School, and the Fred Saskamoos All-Star Hockey Week. Furthermore, he actually served with the NHL on their Ethnic Diversity Task Force and was a board member for the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. He served as chief of his community as well as a counselor for 35 years before becoming a senator with the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations. And he continued to promote youth in sports during this time. He helped break the cycle of the racial barrier for Indigenous hockey players. And he told in a 2015 interview, "It's a different world from now. They compete in the world outside, starting as young kids." And he says he's satisfied with his life and how it worked out. Now, just some of his accomplishments. So in 1994, he's one of the first athletes to be inducted into the Saskatchewan First Nations Sports Hall of Fame. He was inducted into the Saskatchewan Hall of Fame in 2007 and the Saskatchewan Hockey Hall of Fame in 2012. In 2014, he participated in the first ever celebration of First Nations hockey. And in 2017, he performed the ceremonial puck drop prior to the Oiler and Blackhawk game. And this was in recognition to his appointment to the Order of Canada. Now, unfortunately, Fred passed away last year, November 24th, at the age of 86 after being diagnosed with COVID. So it was a substantial loss for the community. And I was able to find part of his statement that he gave to the TRC, and this is what he said. "Although I was a good player, I never felt like I fit into the world of professional sports. I looked at myself and sometimes said, how the hell did I ever get there? I didn't want to be an athlete. I didn't want to be a hockey player. I didn't want to be anything. All I wanted was my parents." Now, here are some couple resources if you're interested in reading a little bit more. I found a book by Will Cardinal, which touches on First Nation hockey players like Jonathan Chichu, Carey Price, Sheldon Soray, and Jordan Tutu. And coming out this May, Fred actually was releasing his own autobiography called Call Me an Indian. So that's coming out in a couple of months. There's also the fictional case of Richard Wagames's Indian Horse. You can also find that movie. And not that long ago, there was a Tom Longboat book that was released called Reclaiming Tom Longboat, which traces the long journey of sports from state-sponsored elimination of Indigenous values to empowerment, decolonization, and determination.
Just before you carry on, Kayla, we have a question in the chat. On your slide that had the call to action number 87, it says completed at the top. And the question from Amanda was, why does it say completed?
So that goes back as to what CBC Beyond considers complete. So that's my rating system that I was using. CBC Beyond 94 and the Government of Canada says this call to action is complete. But as I mentioned, it's an ongoing relationship, an ongoing dedication to ensuring that the history and legacy of our Indigenous athletes are recognized. So that's where that comes from. So I wouldn't necessarily call it complete, but working from CBC Beyond 94, that's what they currently state. So again, number 88, you'll see CBC and Beyond 94 also states this one's complete. So this one says, we call upon levels of government to take action to ensure long-term Indigenous athlete development, growth, and continuing support for the North American Indigenous Games. So in 2017, the government of Canada invested $18 million, about $5 million per year to support Indigenous youth through sport. Investments were allocated to the Aboriginal Sports Circle, to provinces and territories to increase operational capacity for Indigenous sport bodies, as well as for national sports organizations to ensure that long-term athletic development is happening. Now, the most recent updates I have is the 2020 North American Indigenous Games have been postponed due to COVID. It states they were postponed indefinitely, but I have read some things about potentially something happening in 2021. However, the 2021 Master Indigenous Games that were scheduled for this August have also been postponed. New dates have yet to be released for either. So not started. So we call upon the federal government to amend the Physical Activity in Sports Act to support reconciliation by ensuring policies to promote physical activity as a fundamental element of health and well-being. So the objectives of this act are to encourage, promote, and develop physical activity in sport in Canada. The objectives of the federal government's policy regarding physical activity are to promote physical activity, encourage Canadians to improve their health, and to assist in reducing barriers faced by Canadians. So in 2017, there were some meetings held between the Aboriginal Sports Circle Board of Directors, as well as the Minister of Sports and Persons with Disabilities. But I can tell you there have been no amendments to the Physical Activity in Sport Act to date. The most recent information that was released is the reports that you see here from 2005. So Sports Canada's policy on Aboriginal peoples participating in sport. All right, number 90 is we call upon the federal government to ensure national sports policies, programs, initiatives are inclusive of Indigenous peoples, related to stable funding, related to athletic development programs for coaches that are culturally relevant, and anti-racism awareness and training programs. So in 2015, Sport Canada reinstated funding for the Aboriginal Sports Circle, which was previously denied funding in 2010. In 2008, the federal government committed to investing in the development of Indigenous communities for sports for Indigenous communities. So in that same year, they also put funding aside for the Native American Indigenous Games, North American Indigenous Games, to match provincial funding. For the second portion regarding programs to create more elite Indigenous athletes, we have the Sports for Life release of the Aboriginal long-term participation development pathway. It's meant as a toolkit and workshop to evolve one's abilities to serve Indigenous participants, participants, coaches, and volunteers. There was also the Aboriginal Sport and Recreation New Brunswick, which partnered with the Rugby Union to create Indigenous Spruce Rugby program. In 2020, the Manitoba Aboriginal Sport Recreation Council accepted stewardship for the Manitoba Indigenous Games, founded by Opaskwayak Cree Nation. So this upcoming May, in partnership with schools and school divisions, the MIG will hopefully see this comeback. It's also supporting access traditional games and programs, providing equipment to 5-day wilderness expedition with Canadian Parks and Wilderness for Northern youth. For culturally relevant programs for coaches and sports, there was the release of this Indigenous Communities Active for Life. It's a culturally tailored resource designed for Indigenous community members like parents, elders, and educators to provide healthy living as a vehicle to holistic development of both the individual and community. And when it comes to anti-racism training, so the University of Toronto Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education created a task force on race and race and indigeneity. And there was also the launch of the revised version for Aboriginal coaching modules. Okay, almost done here. So we call upon the officials and host countries of international sporting events such as the Olympics, Pan Am community to ensure that the Indigenous peoples' territorial protocols are respected and local Indigenous communities are engaged in all aspects. I'm going to skip down to the most recent developments. Sport Canada is currently reviewing how Indigenous groups were engaged with during the 2010 Olympics and the 2015 Pan and Para-Pan American Games. There were no formal consultations or participation of Indigenous communities planned for the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. And last year it was announced that the Tokyo Olympics Committee dropped a performance by members of the Anu ethnic minority from the Games opening ceremony. Okay, so that brings us updates to our last couple slides here. Closing up with Eugene here. So he explains that in 1972, he explains that in 1972, a team of former residential school students were brought together to compete in the Saskatchewan Summer Games, which he participated in. They were the only First Nations team that were followed around by cameras and put down in a rundown hotel. The night before the semifinals, the team went out drinking and they lost the match, which put them into the bronze medal game. Eugene's regret is that they could have come out of the games with a gold or silver medal as they had previously beat those teams if it hadn't been for their nativity and for the community taking advantage of them. So after learning how to skate again since he left residential school in 1969, Eugene went around looking for a spot on a hockey team. He signed with Koopman Knights. Everything that is shown in the Indian Horse film he experienced. He used his survival skills while playing hockey and was known as a rough and tough player. He had the most penalty minutes and was the most suspended player in 3 years, and this was expected of him. Eugene later signed with the North Battleford Beaver Blues and said playing semi-professional hockey changed his life. They treated him well and he was afforded the same comforts as his white teammates. He felt respected and accepted. He played with them from 1975 to 1981 and even got to try out for a team in the United States. And he stated in his little article, I played hockey because I loved the game and I had been told that I was good at it. But unfortunately, alcohol, drugs, and dysfunctional lifestyle dominated my psyche at this point in my life. Ooh, okay, now my literal last slide, I won't pause unless we do have one time to view a 3-minute clip. I don't want to take up too much of your time, which I have already. Okay. All right, so this was a really great story that came out this year involving the Irish men's lacrosse team and the Iroquois Nationals here in Canada. The Irish men's team placed 12th in the World Championships in Israel, and they learned that the Iroquois Nationals would not be invited to the World Games in Alabama. And so after surveying their board members, coaches, and teams, they decided that they would actually voluntarily withdraw from the World Nationals to make room for the Iroquois. And so this October, they were actually awarded the Musel Award for Good Sportsmanship. So I have a clip. I have a clip I will share with that. And this will be my last piece of the day.
Because the 2022 World Games is a multi-sport event, there are only 8 teams which would be invited to compete. Because the Iroquois Nationals aren't recognized by the International Olympic Committee, they would not get an invite for that event. This is unusual that the Iroquois Nationals, the 3rd best team in the world, weren't able to compete in this major event.
Has there been a mistake? Is our invitation lost in the mail? And we're third in the world. We're the originators of the game. There's no better ambassadors for the game. It's kind of an old story. You know, we've always had a challenge being who we are.
The sport of lacrosse has an extremely unique history. The Indigenous people of North America have been playing the game for hundreds of years. They have gifted the game of lacrosse to the rest of the world.
The Onondaga Reservation is just a couple miles from here, where this sport of lacrosse originated from.
French call us Iroquois. English call us Six Nations. Haudenosaunee is our proper name. This is birthplace of the long stick game.
Including the Iroquois in the World Games, it's not necessary.
I think this issue hit a chord with a lot of people. It also evoked the potential that sport and sportsmanship can have in promoting ideals of social justice.
Rules and conventions and policies that have been in place in the past may need a fresh look. They may need to be revisited in light of current events, in light of what's happening in our world today.
Our players, our fans, our administrators, and our supporters were wanting to know what could Ireland do to enable the Iroquois nationals to compete. They recognize this as an opportunity to give back.
We got in touch with Ireland Lacrosse, and it was a very, very simple discussion.
We were ready with an answer, and I said, you know, guys, we're going to make this very easy. We're willing to voluntarily vacate our position in this tournament to ease the pathway for the participation of the Iroquois nationals.
Turned over to Lyle Thompson, and he scores!
Now, I feel like I got even more to play for. It has been a huge moment for lacrosse history. What it did was really bring the whole lacrosse community together as one mind.
What they've done is put the values of our game, the creators' game, into action.
Peace, friendship. That was our foundation of the game.
I've said there's no reason for you to be so thankful to us. We are grateful to you. Everything that I personally and that everybody involved in lacrosse in Ireland gained from the sport, we owe to the Iroquois.
For them to give up a spot in the World Games that everybody struggles for, it is a good ray of light, and we should make the most of it.
Okay, so you can see kind of why I wanted to end my presentation on this really great story. When we talk about reconciliation, what does that look like in sports? I think that is an absolutely beautiful and wonderful example of sportsmanship, of all the great qualities that you want to invoke your team members into doing. So that's the end of my presentation for today, and I took up quite a bit of time, but if there were any other questions, I'd be happy to answer. I see, will the recording be made available? I see some nods. Yes, the recording of today's would be available.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kayla. That was great to have you, and to thank you for sharing your knowledge with us all. For anyone that, if you have a question that maybe for whatever reason you weren't comfortable asking in the chat or anything like that, you can always send me or Kare an email, and we can get you into contact with Kayla. She also will be providing that email address. We're going to send out a recap email after every day's session that will have links to hopefully the videos. Kayla, are we able to get that? Okay, cool. That any resources will link you up with the NCTR website, and then the book list as well. I'm seeing there's some interest in that too. So we'll send out a recap email after every day session that has all of the information from today and tomorrow and the next day that you might want to access afterwards, once you've had some time for things to digest and to kind of settle. So yeah, thanks once again, Kayla. You are, of course, again, more than welcome to stick around for the rest of our presentation, but if you have somewhere else to be, we also understand. We thank you so much for joining us for this and sharing your time with us. Oh yes, and Kare is also showing some of the resources that you all as participants. We have the novel A Knock on the Door, that everyone who attends all 3 days will be getting a copy of that. And then we also have the Pocket Truth and Reconciliation. So this is all of the calls to action. And those have been provided to us from the from NCTR. So thank you for that, Kayla, as well. And then the third one is the book They Came for the Children. So that is one that focuses more on that residential school history and education. And we have it both in English and in French. So we are just going to put everyone down mostly for, I think, English copies. If you would like a French copy, just let me know and I can just make a note that you'd prefer a French copy for that. So what we'll do then is I'm going to change my view here. There we go. So now I'm just going to speak a little bit about what we can do to, because I know there seems to be some confusion, and Amanda asking, like, why does it say completed above the calls to action? And as far as I am concerned, as we are concerned, the calls to action, specifically the ones to sport, because that is our realm that we are most familiar with, won't be completed until these things are just like second nature, are just naturally occurring at all levels of sport and recreation for all Indigenous people in mainstream sport and that. So I just want to tell you guys a little bit about my story before I start my presentation. So for those of you who don't know me on a more personal basis, I have been working with the MASRC for about the last 2.5 years. And when I started, I didn't have as much connection to my cultural identity as I do now. So it has been a huge opportunity for me to grow in my Indigenous identity and also my role in the work that I do now. So I kind of just want to tell you guys a story, because I grew up playing sports, but I was raised in a small town in northern BC. I was born in Winnipeg, but my parents moved our family there when I was very, very young. So I grew up kind of disconnected from the rest of my extended family. So we didn't have a lot of family time. And so we were kind of removed from that community and that connection in that way. But my mère and père would come and visit us once a year, maybe sometimes twice a year, just depending on the time. And I remember when they used to come for these visits and my père would fiddle. And I remember as soon as I saw that fiddle case come out, he would take it out and he'd open it up and then he'd be rosining up his bow. And as a little kid, I was probably like 3 or 4 years old, and I was just like, just so excited for what I knew was coming, because it was just I didn't understand, of course, at that time what I was experiencing, but it was such an experience. And so I just knew, and there was something that happened in my body as soon as he started to play and started to fiddle. It was like I had to move. It was like almost uncontrollably, and it was something that made me so happy on every level of myself as a small child. And I remember like the whole family being gathered around, and of course all the adults are laughing like, oh, look, she's doing the Red River Jig, And I'm like, I didn't know what I was doing. I was 3 years old. I was just flailing around and doing what felt good in my body. And now looking back on all of the opportunities I had to participate in sport and recreation as I grew older, it was like that opportunity for me to be fully present as my full self never really existed in my sporting experiences in mainstream. So that's definitely something that I have come to realize now as an adult and in my work with MASRC is that's part of what I'm here for, is to make sure that that space exists for Indigenous athletes or Indigenous people participating in whatever recreation or physical activity it might be, that those spaces are, number one, safe for them to show up as our whole selves. And number two, where it's now can be celebrated and embraced as something that is beneficial for all of us. So yeah, that's where it kind of brings me to where these TRC calls to action come into play, is like, what can we all do to make sure that these changes are being made where they need to be made, and like what are we doing to make sure that this is becoming a reality. And something that we've noticed in working with non-Indigenous folks in mainstream sport is the two most common things or reasons why people seem to not be doing anything or not wanting to start is A, they're either worried about doing it wrong, so they don't do anything, or B, it seems so big and so widespread and so heavy that it's like, I don't know where to start, so I'm not going to start. So that is where I kind of want to focus my presentation today, is we're going to take each one of these sport specific calls to action and we're going to focus it down. We're going to bring it right down to our to a level of what can I do as an individual, whether you are working in sport administration for a PSO, a coach, an official. It doesn't matter what your role in sport is, there is definitely something that you can be doing for these. So with that, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, we can see that, yeah? Okay, perfect. All right, so yeah, so the way that the calls to action are written is it does seem something that's very, very big, because yes, changes do have to happen on a pretty big scale, but a lot of the time changes start small. They start with ourselves, they start within our communities, they start with the influence that we have in our connections and our relationships with one another. So what we have done is we have taken each one of these calls to action, and instead of the beginning of it saying we call on all governments, because that is our voice as Indigenous people saying we are calling on everyone to do these things. So what I've done for you guys, for non-Indigenous folks working in mainstream sport, is to flip that narrative of what can I do? Because this is all of our responsibilities. It's not just the responsibility of Indigenous people to make sure that these changes are being made. This is where we all need to work together. So for each one, we have changed it to what can I do in collaboration with Aboriginal people, sports halls of fame, and other relevant organizations to provide public education that tells the national story of Aboriginal athletes in history. And so for each one of these calls to action, we have broken down into kind of like a level 1, 2, and 3, where it says number 1, like this would be like the basic. If you're not doing anything to address this call to action, this would be a really good place to start, and something that is going to be easily accessible for most everybody. If you are already doing what is listed here, you could move on to number 2 or 3. If your sport community is already addressing all of these areas, fantastic. Do not stop what you're doing, but let's continue to grow. So the first thing for the TRC call to action number 87 that we are saying is something that you can do is very simple. Subscribe to APTN, CBC Indigenous, MASRC. There is tons and tons and tons of Indigenous platforms that are on social media. And so making it a weekly priority to read something and to share it on social media and other platforms is something that is extremely accessible and very easy. So that should be something that everyone should be able to do. Number 2 would be to research and share about past Indigenous athletes and or honor current athletes in your sport. So that's taking it a little further. Again, a lot of the focus for these is going to be connect with the Indigenous people that are already in your sport community. Listen to their stories and all of that kind of stuff, and share and honor and celebrate them. Number 3 is mandating the Aboriginal coaching module as a coach requirement for grassroots events, Manitoba Games, Westerns, et cetera, et cetera. This is one that we have been pushing at MASRC for quite some time now. It's just a really great foundational, like a starting point for coaches or officials or really anybody involved in mainstream sport to start their education process of this. So yeah, so there is those three. One thing that you will also hear me say a lot during this presentation is come and talk to us, come and talk to us, come and talk to us, come and talk to us. This is what we're here for. So number 88, what can I do to take action to ensure long-term Aboriginal athlete development, growth, and continued support for the North American Indigenous Games, including funding to the host games and for the provincial and territorial team preparation and travel? So number one of the most helpful things that you can do is helping MASRC running our tryouts, observing at the tryouts, helping to fill out the selection forms, things like that for NAG. For those of you who aren't familiar with NAG, we at Manitoba, we take 14 sports. Last time we were running the tryouts, so it was supposed to happen in 2020. So we ran all of our tryouts in 2019. We were a staff of 7 at that time? 7 to 10, running 14 tryouts, some of the sports that us personally didn't really know a lot about. So offering help to run those tryouts, it would be huge. I know I have to give a shout out here to athletics, who ran the tryouts for our athletic team, and that was massive. It just freed up a lot of our capacity as a staff to be able to make sure that other things are also getting done. So the other thing that you can do is to offer an option for your athletes and your coaches to self-identify as Indigenous on registration forms. And this doesn't have to be limited to athletes or coaches. This could be board members, this could be officials, this could be anyone who has any sort of registration with your sport organization. And just to highlight here that this should be for to be used for extra resources and support. So maybe connecting them with MASRC, maybe connecting them with different bursaries in that within the sport for Indigenous athletes and not just for reporting purposes to get that gold star, So number 2 would be to host an all Indigenous event or camp for your sport. Of course, this would have to be a post-COVID thing when we're allowed to gather again. But again, MASRC would love to help support you in this. So come and talk to us. And then the third one would be to work to ensure the longevity of Indigenous and Northern coaches. Relationship is key here. So this is making sure that not only are you forming the connection with your coaches who are in more Northern communities or more isolated communities, but making sure to maintain that. And I know that there has been a big shift because with COVID, obviously we have gone more virtual with everything. So everyone always automatically assumes that that means more access for everybody. And in some cases that is true, but just one thing to keep in mind that is not necessarily always true for everyone. There is a lot of communities who are living with either no or very subpar internet access. So it doesn't necessarily mean that these trainings and courses and things like that are more easily accessible for everybody. And I know we've been working a little bit more with Coaching Manitoba, and they've been really great at kind of asking where they can be more supportive in this area. So that is one thing we want to keep up there. And then also, do you have a mentorship program for your developing coaches? If you do not, we have one that you are more than welcome to use. So again, come and talk to us. Exactly. It's a theme here. Come talk to us. Come talk to us. Let's maintain these connections. Let's grow them. So number 89. What can I do to amend the Physical Activity and Sport Act to support reconciliation by ensuring that policies to promote physical activity as a fundamental element of health and well-being, reduce barriers to sports participation, increase the pursuit of excellence in sport, and build capacity in the Canadian sports system are inclusive of Aboriginal peoples? So this is a really big one for people who are board members, are policymakers, are more in that kind of bureaucratic kind of involvement in sport. So this right here, this slide is the link to that act. So I invite you to take a read of that. because it's going to be really important to, number one, making sure that you understand what inclusivity is. Once you feel like you kind of have a grasp on that, reading the Physical and Activity and Sport Act with that lens, specifically those policies that are mentioned in that call to action, really focus in on reading that with that lens of inclusivity, and really spending some time to reflect on that and seeing, oh yes, like currently that is not the case. And if you don't understand why it's not inclusive, again, come and talk to us. We would really love to connect you with a community for more context and some kind of understanding of the things barriers that we as Indigenous people are still facing as far as some of these policies and that. Number 90, what can I do to ensure that national sports policies, programs, initiatives are inclusive of Aboriginal peoples, including but not limited to establishing? And this is a 4-part one, so I'll try and be quick as I read through it. So stable funding for and access to community sports programs that reflect the diverse cultures and traditional sporting activities of Aboriginal peoples. Part 2, an elite athlete development program for Aboriginal athletes. Part 3, programs for coaches, trainers, and sports officials that are culturally relevant for Aboriginal peoples. And Part 4, anti-racism awareness and training programs. So what can you do? Level 1, participating in the Aboriginal Apprentice Coach Program for Canada Games. I know, again, of course, with COVID, everything has been kind of put on hold for now, but that kind of gives you an opportunity to do the research that you need to do if you're not currently involved in this program, taking a look at what kind of things you need to do in order to become part of it and what that would entail and what that would look like for you or for your sport organization. So that would be a good place to start. Number 2 would be advocating for your athletes and your coaches to move up the chain. So this is not only just providing information about opportunities, but it's also helping to guide them through the process. So it's not just sending a quick email and be like, oh, hey, like saw this and thought you might be eligible for it and never checking in again. Because especially when we're coming from smaller communities or a place where our sporting community is very culturally different from the mainstream and like all the politics and like the business side that exists in that sometimes can be very foreign and a bit intimidating. So just making sure instead of it just being like, there's this opportunity and it's up to you whether you take it or leave it, presenting it in a way to make sure that that support is available to your athletes and coaches. So contacting them and be like, hey, I saw this great opportunity. I thought it might be something that you're interested in. Do you want to talk about this further? We can go through it together. And then that gives you an opportunity to build that relationship as well. And then number 3, making the ACM or the Aboriginal coaching module mandatory. There is an entire section in the ACM that is based on dealing with racism in sport. So again, this is a really great starting point for the education of coaches and anyone else in mainstream sports. So again, I cannot highlight that enough. That's a great starting point. And then of course, researching and participating in other anti-racism training. Number 91, what can I do to ensure that Indigenous peoples' territorial protocols are respected and local Indigenous communities are engaged in all aspects of planning and participating in events? So level 1 would be making your land acknowledgements a norm in your sport programs. So this is one that has become more common over the last couple of years, but it also has come with a lot of discussion around making sure that it is done intentionally. So not just done to be performative, not just done to check the box. So there is some reflection and some research that needs to go into making an appropriate land acknowledgement so that you understand who and what you're honoring when you're making that land acknowledgement. And so there is some work that needs to go into that to make sure that it's not just checking that box, getting that gold star. So that's something that is important. We have recently developed a good starting point resource of questions to ask yourself information to have a read over, video to watch. So some kind of things that can help spark that starting point of that learning process with it. So level 2 on this one, becoming familiar with the Indigenous communities around where you're hosting your event. So this is definitely something, if you're hosting events outside of Winnipeg, which I'm hoping that you all are, as we are all provincial sport organizations. Again, I understand this might be a post-COVID one, but that's definitely something to keep in mind as well. And then number 3 would be to actually host the event in an Indigenous community that you already have a connection with. This again is something that we can help with. We work with different Indigenous communities all over the province all the time, and have been in attendance at some really amazing events that are hosted by these communities. So that's definitely one thing that would be great as well. And then, as most of our offices, or most of your offices as PSOs or provincial sport organizations, are probably located in Winnipeg, which is on Treaty 1 territory, knowing who your Indigenous coaches are in this treaty territory would also be like the base level of making sure that you are respecting the connections that you currently have. Again, because we are mostly province-wide sport organizations, starting with the area of Treaty 1 would just be that starting point, because you need to also be aware and mindful of all the other treaty areas and unceded territories that exist in Manitoba. So that is something, when we talk about treaties, when we talk about unceded territory, I know that can be kind of unfamiliar to a lot of people. Like, what does that mean? What is a treaty? All of that kind of stuff. Tomorrow's session with Jamie Wilson, who is the former Treaty Commissioner of Manitoba, is going to focus on all of that. He's going to be giving us some really great treaty education. So I highly, highly encourage you, if you hadn't already planned on attending tomorrow, please do. And then I kind of already went over this, but just to highlight again that the land acknowledgements is something that needs to be reflected on and would be customized according to you, your sport organization, if it's something that's going to be posted on the website. And it would also be different if it was something that was going to be spoken at a specific event. So again, there's some effort and research that needs to go into the process to make sure that it's not just performative. For further guidance in crafting what would be an appropriate land acknowledgement, you can absolutely come to us. Like I said, we have put together that resource as a great starting point. We also have started, if you're still not sure even after that, or you don't know if you're doing it right, those kinds of things, come and talk to us. We'll read over it with you. We'll walk through the process of creating it with you. We already do have a couple of PSOs that are in that process with us, which is something that Kaden and I really love to do. So please come and talk to us. And I don't know, I don't see, do we have any questions in the chat box?
Nothing yet.
No.
Just,
okay.
Comments. These are very helpful and constructive.
Good. Yes. So the whole point of this, that is all I have for you for my visual presentation. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen here. But basically what I'm looking for you all to be able to take away from this is to be able to look through this list, and in framing those calls to action in a more personal way. What can I do? What can I do as a coach, as an official, as an executive director, as a volunteer, as a board member? What can I do? What can I commit to in making these calls to action a reality? So that is a list that's like, if you are at a loss of what your starting point is, just pick one of those that is going to be the most realistic for you to actually be able to execute. And once you start with one, you can begin to look, like once that learning experience starts, it will naturally start to grow. As long as you remain engaged with the work and ask the questions when you have questions, come and talk to us, keep building and growing those relationships, and it'll come. So that's all I have for you all. I wanted to make sure that I tell you that in the recap email that goes out this afternoon, my presentation that I just showed you guys, that I just walked you through, will also be attached in there. It's in a brochure PDF form. So it's something you can print out. It's two-sided. It's super easy to get through. So yeah, any other I think we have a couple, 12:02. We're 2 minutes over time, but we're not in a rush. So if anyone does have any questions, comments, concerns, the floor is yours at this point. Okay. All right. And okay. So we will leave it there for now. But again, as I said, if there's anything that comes bubbling up for you after the presentation, maybe you wake up in the middle of the night and you're like, what about this? Send us an email. Let us know. We love to connect and have those conversations with everybody. So I will leave it here for today, and hopefully I will see you all tomorrow. Okay. I just want to stop recording. There we go.
Thanks, Carolyn. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.